Let's see if I can remember how to do this.
I remember seeing this image in the trailers when I was about 16, and I remember being so enchanted by it because it felt so haunting and yet like surreal at the same time. The glass sort of twirling in the air like autumn leaves, and the comedian who seemed to float backwards as if he were flying of his own accord, but despite his mid-air pose that suggests desperation. I hadn't been as awestruck and excited by a moving image since when I first saw the bullet time sequences in The Matrix 8 years prior. I simply had to know what this movie was, and of course it was Watchmen. I sadly missed it when it was in theatres, although I wasn't old enough anyway, but I was given a copy of the film by a friend of mine on my birthday, and I was really taken by its visual content and its spectacular set pieces, but something wasn't quite right about it, I remember thinking at the time. Something didn't sit right with me having read the book in anticipation, and after all these years, something still doesn't sit right with me now.
Basically right there is the purpose of doing this overlong essay in the first place.
Firstly, let's talk about the production history, because fuck me silly, this is just a task in and of itself. The long and the short of it is that between 1987 and 2007 the movie was stranded in development hell. In 1986, Lawrence Gordon bought the rights on behalf of 20th Century Fox and hired Joel Silver, who would later make a name for himself on projects such as Die Hard and The Matrix, as producer. Alan Moore had originally been tapped to type up the screenplay, but when he declined, the studio hired Sam Hamm, who had worked on Tim Burton's Batman, to put together a first draft, which he had turned in 2 years later, clocking in at 128 pages, a task he considered to be very arduous. His first draft took the liberty in changing the ending drastically into what Hamm referred to as more manageable, involving an assassination and a time paradox in which Ozymandias convinces Dr. Manhattan to travel back in time and kill himself before he can be accidentally locked in the intrinsic particle field that gave him his superpowers in the first place, ending with all the characters suddenly in the middle of Times Square, supposedly in our reality, as ordinary people. A couple of years later, with the project still in development, it was put into turnaround, which is a process where a studio can buy a project from another studio and split the box office takings evenly. It was bought by Warner Brothers, with Lawrence Gordon and Joel Silver still attached as producers, with Terry Gilliam hired as director. Gilliam didn't like what Hamm had done with the characters, and so he hired Charles McKeown, who'd written Brazil and Baron Munchausen for Gilliam, to put together a second draft to flesh out the characters and add things that Hamm's draft had left out, such as entries from Rorschach's journal. Where things fell down was when it came to the budget. Because Joel Silver and Terry Gilliam had famously gone over budget on their previous films Die Hard 2 and Baron Munchausen, they were only able to raise $25 million, which Gilliam felt was only a third of the budget necessary. Shortly afterwards he left the project, retrospectively saying that it would probably work best as a 5-hour miniseries, which incidentally I hear they are now doing at HBO. Fast forward to 2001, with Lawrence Gordon having taken the project over to Universal Studios, and David Hayter was signed to both write and direct the project, having only recently come fresh off X-Men and finishing the screenplay for X-Men 2. Hayter's plan was to have the script ready to shoot in early 2002, although he didn't have the first draft ready until July. A couple of rewrites later, the screenplay was finished by July of 2003, with producer Lloyd Levin calling it a much more faithful adaptation of the book, though it sadly fell apart due to creative differences with Universal, and fell apart once again when they moved the project over to the much smaller Revolution Studios. Cut to July of 2004, and Paramount had picked up the rights and had Darren Aronofsky attached, although he left eventually to go and work on The Fountain, and soon after him Paul Greengrass, who'd come off the Bourne Supremacy, was attached and had a planned summer 2006 release. Under Greengrass, the project came so close to heading into production, having done a round of casting and the marketing department having made a now defunct teaser website for the film. Sadly, what happened was that Paramount were amid rumours that several high-profile projects were going to get their budgets cut, so Lloyd Levin was trying to move the production to a different country in order to keep the costs down, though unfortunately Paramount put the project in turnaround again before he could. By October of 2005, the project was back at Warner Brothers, but stated that Paul Greengrass was no longer attached. In addition, they decided to make the project available as an open writing assignment, meaning that professional screenwriters who were interested in the project could send sample pitches forward in the hopes of getting hired. Around the same time, Warners had been very impressed with the dailies for 300, which had not long wrapped at that point, and asked director Zack Snyder if he'd be interested in taking on Watchmen as his next project. Snyder, describing himself as a long-time fan of the book after a couple of weeks of umming and erring over it, decided to take the job, stating that "I figure I'd do it just so no one else fucks it up too badly," with screenwriter Alex C. being hired shortly thereafter. C's approach was to take the best elements of David Hayter's previous drafts and meld them together into a brand new screenplay screenplay and return the story to the Cold War setting in the original book, seeing as Hayter had opted to move the story to a post-9/11 world. Warner Brothers were very comfortable with moving the story back to the 80s, but really took issue with both the length and the R rating that Snyder was fighting for. The other issue was budget. Snyder had originally wanted to shoot the movie for $150 million, but Warner's wanted to keep everything under $100 million. It eventually went into production starting in September of 2009 and ending in February of 2008, with a final budget of roughly $120 million, and saw a release on March 5th, 2009 to a very polarised response from audiences and critics alike.
Now, the reason why I'm even bringing up the production history is because I just want to firmly establish that regardless of whoever ended up making it, regardless of Zack Snyder, Paul Greengrass, Darren Aronofsky or Terry Gilliam, adapting Watchmen into a movie was always going to be a challenge.
The first problem is of course length, so the question with any adaptation as such then becomes what gets cut, which concurrently leads to the second problem, which is that there's simply too much important detail to not cut. The initial cut which Zack Snyder handed into Warner Brothers was 3 hours long, which eventually got wrestled down to 2 hours 42 minutes for the theatrical release, which was preceded by a lot of internal arguments regarding what needed to be taken out of the film. The biggest removal from the theatrical cut is the scene at the end of the second act, in which the original Night Owl, now an old man, is murdered at his home by the Top Nuts. In previous drafts, the biggest problem in adaptation appears to have been how to handle the ending, with Sam Hamm's initial proposal having cut it out entirely to be replaced with a different conclusion. The ending we have is an ending taken from a draft by David Hayter and kept in at the insistence of Zack Snyder and Alex C., which basically replaces the giant alien monster with a tachyon bomb, giving the appearance that Dr. Manhattan has turned on humanity. To be honest, as a way of saving yourself several million quid in the digital effects department, it's really not a bad way of going about it, especially seeing as it means that one of the characters has to take a more personal stance on their decision to keep quiet.
On the other hand, it's kind of weird to take away something that's actually a lot more fundamental to the story than one realises.
Watchmen is a superhero comic about superhero comics, and thus heavily relies on its own tropes in order to get its point across. As we said before, Alan Moore's comics are comics as comics. Giant alien monsters are actually a fairly common foe, particularly in Silver Age superhero books, and so the story opts to take that idea and mangle it to the heights of cosmic horror for maximum effect. So I can't help but feel that the implicit attitude taken as, well, a giant alien monster would be too ridiculous on film is exactly the reason why you probably shouldn't try Watchmen as a movie in the first place.
At the same time though, this movie was made between 2005 and 2009, smack in the middle of a great big superhero resurgence, so it's not entirely unreasonable to assume that the audience wouldn't go for a giant alien squid. And it's right there, when you realise the time frame it was made in, that you also realise its reason for existing. Watchmen as a movie doesn't so much exist as an excuse to tell a compelling story or to inject mature political themes or complexity into the genre, so much as it does exist because of marketing.
Watchmen within comic book circles is one of the most lauded and well-known works of comic book storytelling, so when superhero comics are in vogue for adaptation, it was kind of inevitable that someone would at least try and make a stab at putting the thing on screen. Again. I can't help but feel cynical about this kind of thing, mainly because I can't help but imagine a group of executives sitting around a table with Watchmen as the topic of conversation, but not really saying anything about the depth, or the postmodernism, or the intertextuality, or any of the stuff that matters, but instead using the words gritty, mature audiences comic book, coupled with the phrase, did you see how much 300 Sin City wanted and The Dark Knight made, before giving the thing the green light. But hey ho, things have been greenlit for worse reasons, and it is nice to see that someone actually did make a movie out of Watchmen, finally. So regardless, the movie does at least have some historical value as a work unto itself, as a piece of film/comic history. Someone actually took this great big ambitious comic book miniseries and turned it into a great big ambitious 3-hour Hollywood blockbuster. David Hayter, one of the screenwriters, in a quotation from 2001, shortly after the World Trade Center attacks, said this of a potential Watchmen movie. Watchmen was considered too dark, too complex, too smart, but the world has changed. I think that the global climate has finally caught up with the vision that Alan Moore had in 1986. It is the perfect time to make this movie.
And I wholeheartedly agree. I think now probably is the best time for a Watchmen movie, but the problem with the end product is that it isn't set now.
The biggest setback to Snyder's adaptation of Watchmen is that in a bid to remain faithful to the source material, the end result is a film that becomes faithfully anachronistic. The alternate present day of Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons' original comic reflected contemporary concerns and pressures that affected people in the 80s. It cast a sceptical eye over the narratives of doom and human fate, of power and shady compromise that dominated the dying days of the Cold War. It was timely. By keeping the present day of the characters in the mid-80s, rather than creating an equivalent alternate present scenario for the 21st century, Snyder has delivered a film which, for want of a better term, is a kind of dystopian period drama. The grime and sense of dread and moral ambiguity are there, but no longer in service of any timely message or question. It's a bit like a gangster film that sets itself in Prohibition Chicago. There's grit and corruption, but it's past, and it's also somehow safe. It criticises fallacies and injustices that have passed by, shines a light on mistakes which have long since been realised and disavowed. Contemporary noir or neo-noir can be challenging. Period noir is simply nostalgia with a noir aesthetic. Of course, in a sense, it's difficult to blame the filmmakers for this because they've done their best. During the several years and multiple writers and directors it took to realise this adaptation, attempts were made, of course, to develop it into an updated 2000s version of the story, including the possibility of leaning in hard on the potential 9/11 parallels of Ozymandias' terrorism. This can be seen in a few elements which reach the final draft of the script. For instance, the idea of achieving peace through renewable energy in particular is an innovation of the screenwriters. However, ultimately it probably is impossible to remove the main plot of Watchmen to the 21st century because the key story threads which support it are locked so tightly into the chronology of the Cold War. The conditions that produced superheroes in the 30s could not be transferred to the 60s, for example. Superman, Hitler, McCarthy and Vietnam shaped the story in integral ways. Bringing Watchmen forward into the present would mean leaving too much of it behind, to the point where it probably wouldn't recognisably be Watchmen anymore. And so we end up watching a film produced in the 2000s about an 80s that never happened, examining issues that the real 80s already dealt with.
So not only are we dealing with a version of Watchmen that's been taken off the page, we're also dealing with a story that's been taken out of history.
But whether or not it was made in the style of a big screen action movie or a quite contemplative miniseries for TV, that factor in itself is an achievement. The mountain has been climbed, it has been made.
So now let's turn our attention and focus more closely on what's actually on the screen, or more specifically the words from visionary director of 300, Zack Snyder.
Snyder very wisely, I feel, chose not to shoot the movie on green screen sets like how he'd approached 300, instead opting to build wide open full scale sets in order to give the story a sense of texture and realism. Snyder's world feels very lived in and full, as if people really do cohabit this space, and he has a great ability to use slow motion in order to create a sense of physical mass and weight to things, as if they have a sense of buoyancy in the air. That is, when the shot isn't set against a CGI backdrop. The positives to having Zack Snyder as a helmer of a comic book adaptation is that he really gets comic book sensibility. If you break down any of Snyder's more memorable shots, you can almost imagine what they would have looked like if they were drawn or as moments in sequential art. He seems to have a very good eye when it comes to those big splash page moments and transfers them well onto the screen. So his slow motion shots are essentially his way of trying to get you to focus on and appreciate the great panel work from whichever comic he's adapting. It gets really interesting by the time you arrive at Man of Steel, because even though it's very much a superhero movie, there's no comic it's exclusively adapted from. But still, he manages to find ways to create what seem like iconic moments like either of these, where you can imagine these scenes as a literal series of comic panels coming to life before your eyes.
And once you realise this, Zack Snyder's visual style is much easier to make sense of, but you also realise its limitations.
For instance, and this kind of goes without saying, but I will say it anyway because it's a valid point, comics and movies are two distinct media with separate visual languages that are ultimately similar but communicated in different ways. Movies take into account things like pacing and time, whereas with a comic you could, if you chose to, spend several hours looking at just one image. So when Snyder attempts to meld comic book storytelling with film form, it just doesn't quite work. The reason it doesn't work is obvious when Zack Snyder has to slow the movie down at certain points in order for you to take in the vast amount of visual information that he's trying to convey. Couple that idea with the notion that pacing a movie in any kind of decent and orderly fashion with as many slowed down moments as Snyder likes to include would swiftly and brutally become a logistical nightmare. There's very often a lot of talk, this essay included, about how much of a great visual stylist Zack Snyder is, but the thing is he can't help but be, because that's where 80% of the budget goes on any given Zack Snyder project. Describing Zack Snyder's movies in terms of only the visuals is playing too much in Snyder's hands, and that's a problem because Snyder's style as a filmmaker only takes advantage of a very minute portion in the full spectrum of what cinema is capable of. When you look at the fact that Snyder has an extensive background in commercials and music video work before making his feature film debut with Dawn of the Dead, his shortcomings become very clear. And I'm not suggesting for a second that having a background in commercials and music videos inherently makes you a bad director. There's been great filmmakers such as David Fincher, Mark Romanek and Michel Gondry who've all gone on to have excellent careers in film after the fact. What I am suggesting is that Snyder simply does not have the skills or the robust visual vocabulary necessary to keep an audience engaged through at least an hour and a half's worth of visual narrative. As is already immediately obvious, Watchmen, as a movie under Zack Snyder's guidance, is not Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons' comic. It doesn't really constitute a movie adaptation in the traditional sense. As a work of commercial art, Zack Snyder's film more so consists of a purely visual interpretation of Watchmen, and both the comic and the movie are perfectly enjoyable on that level, but if that's all Watchmen was, I'm not sure I'd respect it as much as I do.
I think the fundamental frustration I have here is that Zack Snyder's visual style is an inherent simplification of visual narrative in both comics and movies, which is why he ultimately opts to just adapt Watchmen into a series of admittedly impeccable moving images. But it's almost as if he doesn't understand, or perhaps doesn't even care, about what Watchmen as a movie could be.
It's understandable, if regrettable, that someone could look at a comic book for a hypothetical adaptation and only see it as a series of panels yet to be animated by movement. In fact, I actually think we have a really bad habit of viewing comics as cheaply made movies where we're forced to imagine the panels as a series of moving shots in our heads. There is of course a fundamental difference between a still image and an image that gives the impression of movement. I mean, Impressionist painters figured that one out back in the 19th century. But the inherent problem with viewing comics in such a simplistic fashion is that not only does it handicap one's perception of comics, it also handicaps one's perception on film by extension and on visual narrative as a whole, a point demonstrated by Zack Snyder's complete and utter devotion to making sure that the visuals of Watchmen are as perfectly tuned as they can be before anything else can be achieved, in a marvellous example of putting the cart before the horse. But the other thing about film is that it isn't like painting or drawing in which an image can be plucked out of thin air. Just about everything you see needs to be built beforehand. Okay, there's digital effects, but that's kind of missing the point. The point is that moving images have texture, whilst a comic panel implies texture with colour and line. There are other natural elements that get captured as part of the shooting process: sound, time, depth perception, and so forth. What I'm trying to express is that a version of Watchmen where all the images move and speak wouldn't be an inherently inferior version, provided one tries to utilise as much of what the medium has to offer, much like what Watchmen did with its own medium. There's so much that Watchmen potentially could be, and yet it simply isn't. Snyder's adaptation, because of his style, feels limiting, even though the sensory aspects of film are potentially so much more. Speaking only for myself, I feel like we're seeing something of a rise in cinematic minimalism, or rather a notable widespread distillation of cinematic vocabulary into its base components. The sound is getting louder, the visuals are getting more layered and detailed, and the camera manoeuvres in a more grand and pronounced fashion. It's a style that appears to be very much in vogue within Hollywood blockbuster circles, and Zack Snyder, or more specifically Michael Bay, feel a lot like Patient Zero for this type of aesthetic. So much focus is put on the visuals that practically everything else feels like an afterthought, as if what matters most to Snyder is what it looks like, whilst ignoring what's happening. For example, Snyder has a very keen interest in the amount of violence that takes place in Watchmen, such as the fight in the alleyway with the Top-Knots, the rape sequence with Silk Spectre and the comedian, and the sequence where Rorschach kills a child murderer and has his big psychological breakdown, to the point where it comes off almost like a perverse emphasis on the violence. And yet, when half of New York gets destroyed, it's entirely bloodless, rendering the most important moment in Watchmen's story completely meaningless because there's no sense of gravitas, and because of the lack of background detail in order to keep the story as clean and straightforward as possible. There's no sense of stakes. The difference here is that when Ozymandias in the book says he's killing millions to save billions, you feel the impact of the lives being lost and the consequences of what's to come, whilst in the movie, the millions he's referring to just feel inconsequential, given how much blood has already been shed before that point. The reason why the big alien attack works so well is because the entire comic had been building up to it with those 8 dialogueless splash pages. Snyder's problem here is that he has a tendency to fall back on iconography and established characters to mask his own shortcomings as a storyteller. A lot of his stories rely very heavily on your recognition of certain characters and moments being played with or referred to in order to be emotionally engaged. This is an idea that permeates a lot of Snyder's body of work. Dawn of the Dead is functionally the same as the original, with the exception of nicking the running zombies from 28 Days Later, but without any of the sense that they made in 28 Days Later. 300 is essentially a panel-for-panel recreation of its source, more or less. Sucker Punch is a mishmash of geek ephemera battling for screen time. Dragons, Nazi zombies, robots, shoguns, ass-kicking samurai girls in short skirts, held together by a plot structure cribbed from Inception. Even up to now, with Batman v Superman Dawn of Justice, which leans heavily on the iconography of Frank Miller's Dark Knight Returns. But just try and remember how successful that was, with a version of Batman no one's ever seen before, and a Superman no one seems to get along with.
The name of the game with this adaptation is to be as preserving and puritanical of the text as possible, which is admirable, but it raises the question of what said adaptation is even for.
As Evan Pushak, the nerd writer, brilliantly pointed out, these kind of intertextual moments are a lot like unicorn's blood in that they keep a story alive but with half a soul. Watchmen, as a movie, suffers from this problem because the entire movie is built out of those kind of intertextual moments. Individually, the best sequence in the movie is the sequence in which Manhattan is having his existential crisis while standing on Mars, but the reason why it works as well as it does is because Billy Crudup is giving an incredible amount of emotional weight and giving every inch of his talents to a character and dialogue most of the audience are well and truly familiar with. There's also a fundamental difference in style between the two versions of Watchmen. Snyder obviously knows that it's impossible to fully recreate the secondary palette look that John Higgins gave the comic, so he instead opts to use his own cinematic influences on the screen, citing in particular both Martin Scorsese's Taxi Driver and David Fincher's Seven, though if you ask me there's also a touch of Blade Runner in there somewhere. That kind of thing is really great thinking from Snyder in order to create an aesthetic reference point that film enthusiasts could be familiar with, but it leads to some real issues when it comes to changing the original meaning behind certain decisions. As a tiny example, Ozymandias in the original comic had an Egyptian-themed costume because he was obsessed with legacy, empire and utopia. On the other side of the coin, Ozymandias looks the way that he does in the movie because Zack Snyder wanted to parody George Clooney's costume from Batman and Robin. It's an amusing in-joke, but it feels like there's something being taken away at the expense of it. In Snyder's Watchmen, the World Trade Center is very subtly and carefully placed in the background of certain shots, never overtly bringing up 9/11 because none of the characters could, obviously, but just subtly enough that when you notice it, it can't help but feel like the spectre of future events is haunting over the story as a thematic warning. You could probably argue that this is the movie's own attempt at creating its own intertextuality, a la an event that is doomed to happen, but again, it feels more like Snyder is leaning on an important recognisable event rather than actually saying anything that implies meaning. So it's there, he wants you to know that it's there, but he has nothing to say. There's also a big problem when it comes to the ending. As I said before, the way in which the movie treats human life as expendable basically means that there's a profound lack of stakes when it comes to the climax. The big moral debate over whether or not it's okay to take lives in order to protect others gets plenty of airtime, but we never see the characters interact with the general populace unless under the context of violence or contempt. It's almost as if the background characters only exist so Snyder can film them being punched in the face and linger on the excessive gore that protrudes from their injuries.
It's like he's trying to recreate the work of his predecessors, but just doesn't quite understand the mechanics of how it works in the first place.
See, a while ago I found this really interesting interview he did back in 2009 with IGN, in which he's asked about which movies he'd like to take as his Desert Island DVDs, and Star Wars, of course, gets a mention, but the other two, rather surprisingly, were A Clockwork Orange and RoboCop. And the moment he said that, I suddenly got it. He mentions that he really likes them both because they similarly have an aesthetic where the tone and story are at odds, in both cases the tone being fun whilst the story is dark. And if you were able to reach out across a medium divide and grab the closest movie equivalent to Watchmen as a comic, then you'd probably end up grabbing something that looked an awful lot like RoboCop. As I said a minute ago, in a medium transfer you tend to look for visual shorthands to connect the audience with something unfamiliar in order to adapt the genre language to that of film, so I can imagine a superhero version of RoboCop would actually be a decent looking template for a potential Watchmen movie. They're both similarly violent and have a similarly murky underbelly working behind the story. But the problem is that Watchmen isn't RoboCop. It's far too complicated for easy diagnosis. RoboCop's fun, jovial package was a decision that made it feel as if the movie itself was a product of its own universe. A big-budget, guns-blazing robot shoot-'em-up developed and packaged by corporate think tanks both describes the movie as well as its title character within his own universe, with a heavy dose of self-aware socio-political satire marinating the line between the two. Watchmen was never about extravagant violence. In fact, the book's more violent and lurid aspects work as well as they do precisely because Alan and Dave had been holding it off in other areas of that book, with the violence functioning more like punctuation, and so bringing the violence to the forefront to a degree that that it could almost be described as the selling feature feels like it not only misses the point, but actively goes against the intended theme and message of the source material. How exactly is the preservation of human life meant to feel so important when breaking bones and fountains of gore look this spectacular? There are also major issues that arise when it comes to adopting a jovial tone like the movie Zack Snyder wants to emulate. When the movie has to get into really murky territory such as the aforementioned rape scene and child abduction, because the film has adopted a veneer of detached irony regarding the story and tone, its attempt at presenting these issues seriously comes off as impertinent. It's not necessarily tone deaf, but you get this sense that Snyder is eager to get into the story's horrid underbelly whilst also wanting to include a lot of violence for its own sake in order to appease the popcorn crowd, but he doesn't know how to marry the two into a cohesive whole. And the even bigger issue at play here is that even though I was able to wax lyrically about the book's temporal, multi-threaded postmodernism, the challenge with turning it into a movie isn't so much about how much we can embrace the multifaceted nature of the story, but instead how can Watchmen be compressed into the beats and rhythms of a conventional action movie. So what you basically have with Watchmen feels all too much like a copy-paste of the story followed by some rejiggering in order to get it to fit into a pre-selected template. All too much of Snyder's Watchmen feels impeccably safe, given the potential. It gets to the point where it tricks you into wondering if Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons' 12-issue miniseries was any good to begin with. It's almost like a Cliff's Notes version of Watchmen, enough to give you an idea of what's going on, who the characters are and what they want, in a very function-over-form way of being. A truly worthy film realisation of Watchmen would actually try to issue a challenge, both to its own medium and to the contemporary political landscape in the same way that the book did. It would recognise that in the 80s this book meant something beyond its iconic stylings. It wasn't just a bunch of pretty colours.
See, typically at this point I'm supposed to say, well, if you love the Watchmen comic, then you'll love the Watchmen movie, because there's just more of it. But here, I really don't think that applies, because if you did really love Watchmen, then you understand precisely why it worked in the first place.
The annoying thing about adapting Watchmen so cleanly and so puritanically is that nothing of the original text feels particularly relevant or appropriate to the current climate, which is of course inevitable for any work of fiction, seeing as that's how time works.
If only I could think of a singular image that sums up Watchmen now.
Watchmen in the 21st century has become such a staple in popular culture in a similar fashion to how Nirvana now have, in that their infamy and continued mimetic repetition of their meaning has rendered both empty and ubiquitous. So in a very real sense, Watchmen can't mean anything now, almost as much as there can't be another Watchmen. And ultimately, the movie feels as peripheral as everything else that's come after it. The prequel comics, the toys, the 2 video games based on the movie, the novelty key rings, the t-shirts, that parody Saturday morning cartoon that one guy made, the actual parody comics of Watchmen, and so on and so forth. Watchmen, rather unfortunately and tragically, has suffered the worst fate any element of pop culture can suffer. It has become ephemeral, because it can't be anything other than ephemeral outside of its own time and place. And it's really that which Snyder has brought to the screen, not the weird, dark, dangerous, thought-provoking political dynamite of Alan Moore's comic at the time of its original run in the 80s, but its shadow, its facsimile, its pop culture ghost. Watchmen as a film is the memes, the posters, the shallow references, everything that has innovated the work into the public consciousness and made it safe and familiar, and ultimately everything it was intended not to be. Watchmen as a film, taken as a whole, is a beautiful looking, beautifully acted soap bubble, shattering immediately after just touching beneath the surface. And it's such a shame given the scale of the production, the technical prowess of the director, its dedication and attention to detail, the time it took for it to go from page to screen, and its vast bedrock of source material to draw from. If only it had a pure thought, an idea at the heart of its reverence.
In summary, Zack Snyder's Watchmen is a $120 million empty gesture in place of 12 issues of the best pulp writing of the 20th century. And on that note, I'll call it case closed. So, thank you for tuning in for 25 episodes of what we're referring to as Season 1 of Summit for Pathos, and we'll be back very shortly with what we'll refer to as Season 2. But in the meantime, I'm Matt Crowley, and that was 2 parts on Watchmen.